April 13th, 1991, Bensonhurst, Brooklyn. The evening air was cool and the street was quiet as the sun slowly disappeared behind rows of brick houses. At around 7:45 p.m., a tall, heavy-set man stepped out of his home and walked down the short path toward his car. His name was Bobby Borrello. He was 47 years old, standing 6 feet 3 inches tall and built like a man who had spent his life in rough places. In South Brooklyn, people knew exactly who he was. His reputation had traveled through neighborhoods, social clubs, and street corners for years. Bobby was not just another man from Brooklyn. For more than a decade, he had been deeply connected to one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the United States. More importantly, he had earned the trust of one of the most famous figures in New York's underworld, John Gotti. To many people, Gotti was larger than life. Newspapers called him the Dapper Don. Cameras followed him everywhere. Federal agents watched his every move. But when Gotti moved through the city, there was always one man nearby, Bobby Borrello. Bobby drove him to meetings, stood beside him in public, and made sure nothing unexpected happened when the boss stepped out of a car. In that world, being the boss's driver and protector was not just a job. It meant complete trust. And trust like that was rare. Over the years, Bobby had proven himself again and again. He had faced arrests, investigations, and countless dangerous situations. Yet he always stayed loyal to the people above him. That loyalty had brought him close to power. But being close to power also meant living with constant risk. On that quiet April evening, Bobby walked toward his Lincoln Town car, parked in the driveway outside his home. It was a car he drove often, both for himself and for work. Inside the house, his wife Susan was in the kitchen with their young son. It was a normal evening. Nothing seemed unusual. Bobby was only a few steps away from the car when something changed. Footsteps. He turned slightly, just enough to notice someone approaching from behind. Moments later, several gunshots shattered the quiet street. Neighbors would later say the sounds echoed between the houses like firecrackers. When the noise stopped, Bobby Borrello collapsed beside his car. Inside the house, Susan heard the shouting outside. At first, she thought it was another argument with a neighbor about the driveway. It had happened before. But something about the tone felt different. She rushed toward the front door. When she stepped outside, she saw her husband lying face down on the pavement. Within minutes, emergency responders arrived, but the situation was already clear. Bobby Borrello had died outside his own home. News spread quickly through Brooklyn, but this was not just another crime in New York. Bobby Borrello was John Gotti's trusted bodyguard, one of the closest men to the powerful Gambino crime family boss. If someone wanted to reach Gotti, Bobby was the man standing in the way. So when he died that night, people across the criminal world began asking the same question. Who would dare target someone so close to John Gotti? Rumors started almost immediately. Some people believed the order came from inside the organization. Others believed Bobby had tried to step away from the life and someone decided he knew too much. But none of those stories were completely true. The real explanation was far more complex, and it involved something almost unbelievable. 2 active New York City police detectives secretly working for a rival crime family. But to understand how Bobby ended up in that dangerous position, we have to go back many years earlier, back to the streets where he grew up. Bobby Borrello was born March 31, 1944, in South Brooklyn. At that time, Brooklyn looked very different from what people see today. Neighborhoods were tightly connected communities. Families often lived in the same blocks for generations. Local churches, social clubs, and small businesses created strong networks between residents. But behind that sense of community, another powerful force operated quietly: organized crime. Several major crime families had deep roots in Brooklyn. Names like Gambino, Genovese, and Colombo were known throughout the city. For many young men growing up there, the presence of organized crime was simply part of daily life. Expensive cars appeared outside social clubs. Well-dressed men gathered for long conversations on street corners. Money moved quietly through businesses that looked ordinary from the outside. To a teenager watching from nearby sidewalks, it could seem like a world filled with power and respect. Bobby saw that world up close. His younger brother, Stevie Borello, became friendly with members of a local crew that operated in neighborhoods like Carroll Gardens and Red Hook. These were serious individuals who controlled illegal businesses and neighborhood rackets. Bobby, taller and stronger than most people around him, quickly earned a reputation as someone who could handle himself in difficult situations. While others focused on small jobs or street hustles, Bobby naturally stepped into the role of muscle. By his early 20s, he was already working with members of the local crew, helping enforce rules and protect their operations. Between 1967 and 1972, he was arrested several times for different offenses. Police officers knew his name. They knew who he associated with. But proving serious criminal activity in those days was often difficult. Witnesses stayed silent, and evidence rarely lasted long. Each time Bobby was arrested, eventually he walked back onto the streets. But the criminal world around him was changing. In 1972, a major figure connected to the local crew was killed at a restaurant in Manhattan. His death caused tension between several crime groups and shifted the balance of power across Brooklyn. As alliances changed, Bobby slowly began moving toward a different organization, one that was even more powerful: the Gambino crime family. At the same time, another man from Brooklyn was rising quickly inside that organization. His name was John Gotti. Gotti was known for his sharp suits, confident personality, and fearless reputation. Unlike many bosses who stayed hidden, he often appeared in public, speaking confidently and attracting attention. People respected him. Some even admired him. But behind that image was a leader who expected complete loyalty from the people around him. And Bobby Borello proved he could provide that loyalty. During the late 1970s and early 1980s, Bobby became closely connected to Gotti's crew. Eventually, he was given a role that only a few people ever received. He became Gotti's driver and personal protector. When Gotti stepped out of a car, Bobby stepped out first. When meetings happened, Bobby stood nearby. If anything unexpected occurred, Bobby was the man expected to react immediately. In organized crime, that position meant one thing above all else: trust. You did not stay in that role unless the boss believed in you completely. Over time, Bobby and Gotti became more than just co-workers. They spent weekends together. They attended events, shows, and social gatherings. Federal investigators photographed them repeatedly during surveillance operations. In the eyes of law enforcement, Bobby was not just another associate. He was part of Gotti's inner circle. By the late 1980s, Bobby Borello had officially become a made member of the Gambino crime family. For someone who had grown up on the streets of South Brooklyn, it meant he had reached the center of a powerful organization. But in that world, reaching the center of power often meant standing closer to danger than anyone else. And Bobby Borello was now standing directly beside one of the most powerful bosses in New York. The same position that gave him influence and respect would eventually place him in the path of forces far more dangerous than he ever expected. And by 1991, those forces were already moving.
quietly, carefully, preparing for the moment when Bobby Borello would walk out of his house one last time.
By the late 1980s, Bobby Borello had reached a position most men in organized crime could only dream about. He was no longer just a street enforcer from Brooklyn. He had become a made member of the Gambino crime family, one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the United States. Even more importantly, he stood close to the man at the very top, John Gotti. For Bobby, this meant more than status. It meant responsibility. Every day he moved through a world filled with risk, loyalty, and constant pressure. The Gambino family controlled operations across New York City, and those operations brought in enormous amounts of money. Construction projects, transportation businesses, gambling networks, and private clubs were all part of the system. Bobby played an important role in protecting and managing some of these activities. His crew operated across Brooklyn, Queens, Manhattan, and Staten Island. They handled trucking routes, construction deals, and loan operations that quietly moved money through the city. People who worked with Bobby understood one thing very clearly. He took business seriously. If someone interfered with his crew's operations, Bobby responded quickly and firmly. His reputation grew stronger each year, and within the organization, he became known as a reliable leader. But in the world of organized crime, power always comes with enemies, and Bobby had begun to attract the attention of some very dangerous people. During the early 1990s, tensions between New York's major crime families were growing. For decades, these organizations had worked together through agreements and shared rules. But when leadership changed, old alliances often disappeared. One event had already shaken the balance of power years earlier. In December 1985, the boss of the Gambino crime family, Paul Castellano, was killed outside a restaurant in Manhattan. The operation had been organized by John Gotti. The move made Gotti the new boss of the Gambino family almost overnight. Many people inside the criminal world admired the boldness of the decision, but not everyone approved. Other crime families believed the takeover had happened without proper approval from the Mafia's ruling commission. Some leaders quietly held grudges over the event. One man in particular never forgot it. His name was Anthony "Gaspipe" Casso. Casso was a powerful figure in the Lucchese crime family, another major organization operating in New York. Within that family, he had a reputation for being extremely aggressive and ruthless when dealing with rivals. If someone crossed him or his organization, he rarely ignored it. And over time, Casso began building a list of people he considered enemies. According to several sources inside the criminal world, Bobby Borello's name eventually appeared on that list. Why? Partly because of his close connection to John Gotti, but also because of tensions that had developed between different crews operating in the same areas of the city. In organized crime, small disagreements could easily grow into serious conflicts. Arguments over money, territory, or respect often led to retaliation. And by the early 1990s, the atmosphere between several families had become tense. At the same time, another major event shook the Gambino organization. In December 1990, John Gotti was arrested and charged with serious federal crimes. This time, the case against him was much stronger than previous investigations. Federal prosecutors believed they finally had enough evidence to convict him. With Gotti behind bars while waiting for trial, leadership inside the Gambino family had to be reorganized. To keep the organization running, a 5-member ruling panel was created to handle important decisions. Among the people involved in managing operations was John Gotti Jr., the boss's son. And working closely with that leadership structure was Bobby Borello. By this time, Bobby had been promoted to acting capo,
meaning he controlled his own crew and oversaw multiple operations. For someone who had grown up on the streets of Brooklyn, it was a powerful position. At 47 years old, Bobby had finally reached the level of authority he had spent his life working toward. But this success also made him far more visible. Law enforcement agencies were watching closely. Rival groups were paying attention. And somewhere in the background, people were beginning to consider removing him. While Bobby focused on running his crew's operations, another secret development was unfolding in New York. It involved two men who were supposed to be on the opposite side of organized crime. They were police detectives. Their names were Louis Ippolito and Stephen Caracappa. Both men worked for the New York City Police Department and had long careers investigating serious crimes. On the surface, they appeared to be experienced officers dedicated to their jobs. But behind the scenes, something very different was happening. According to later investigations, the two detectives had secretly begun working with Anthony Casso. In exchange for thousands of dollars each month, they provided him with confidential police information. They accessed files, they checked addresses, they identified potential witnesses and informants. Information that should have been used to stop crimes instead was passed directly to one of the most dangerous figures in organized crime. Casso used that information carefully. Whenever he needed to locate someone or confirm a target's location, the detectives could quietly gather the details. It was a level of inside access that almost no organized crime organization had ever possessed before. And eventually, that secret connection would be used in a plan involving Bobby Borriello. By early 1991, Casso had decided Bobby needed to be eliminated. The exact reasons remain debated even today. Some investigators believe it was revenge related to past conflicts between crews. Others believe it was connected to threats Bobby had allegedly made during conversations that were later recorded. Whatever the exact reason, Casso made a decision. Bobby Borriello had to go. But before anything could happen, the location had to be confirmed. And that is where the detectives became involved. Using their position inside the police department, they were able to quietly verify where Bobby and his family were living in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn. The information was passed to Casso. Once the address was confirmed, the final step could begin. Casso arranged for a trusted member of the Lucchese organization to carry out the job. His name was Frank Lastarino. Lastarino had a reputation for being calm, efficient, and dependable when given difficult assignments. When he accepted a task, people believed it would be completed. And in April of 1991, he received one of the most dangerous assignments of his life. The target was John Gotti's personal bodyguard, Bobby Borriello. Meanwhile, Bobby himself had no idea that anything unusual was unfolding around him. He continued living his normal life in Brooklyn, meeting associates, running business operations, spending time with his family. But the plan against him was already moving forward, and on the evening of April 13, 1991, everything would come to a sudden and violent end.
April 13th, 1991. The afternoon had been ordinary for Bobby Borriello. He had spent part of the day at Aqueduct Racetrack, a place he often visited. Later that evening, he returned home to Bensonhurst, the same neighborhood where he had grown up years earlier. Inside the house, his wife Susan was in the kitchen with their 2-year-old son, Bobby Jr. It was a normal family evening. Their older son, Patrick, was out watching a movie. Nothing about the evening felt unusual. Bobby parked his Lincoln Town car outside the house and stepped out into the quiet street. The sun had already started to fade, leaving the neighborhood in that calm moment between daylight and night. He walked a few steps toward the driveway. Just a few seconds later, a man stepped out from the shadows. It happened very quickly.
several shots echoed through the street. When the noise stopped, Bobby Borello collapsed beside his car. Inside the house, Susan heard shouting outside. At first, she assumed it was another small argument with a neighbor about parking or the driveway. It had happened before. But the voices sounded different this time. She rushed toward the door. When she stepped outside, she saw her husband lying motionless on the ground. Within minutes, emergency responders arrived, but the situation was already clear. Bobby Borello was gone. For the Gambino crime family, the news spread quickly. When John Gotti heard about the killing from prison, he was furious. Bobby had been one of his most trusted men for years. In the criminal world, loyalty like that meant everything. Gotti reportedly gave permission for Bobby's brother, Stevie Borello, to seek revenge for the attack. He also instructed other members of the organization to speak with leaders from rival families to understand what had happened. But despite all the rumors and speculation, no one could clearly explain who had ordered the hit. The mystery remained unsolved. For Bobby's family, the loss was devastating. Susan had suddenly lost her husband. 2 young boys had lost their father. And for years, the most painful question remained unanswered. Who had really set everything in motion? For more than a decade, the truth stayed hidden. Then, in March 2005, something unexpected happened. Federal agents from the FBI and DEA arrested 2 retired police detectives in Las Vegas. Their names were Louis Eppolito and Stephen Caracappa. Both men had spent years working inside the New York Police Department. After retiring, they had moved to Nevada and were living quiet lives. But federal investigators had uncovered evidence linking them to a long list of serious crimes connected to organized crime. The indictment shocked many people in law enforcement. According to prosecutors, the 2 detectives had secretly worked with Anthony "Gaspipe" Casso during the 1980s and early 1990s. Instead of fighting organized crime, they had been helping it. They provided confidential police information, including addresses, investigations, and intelligence about targets. In exchange, they were paid thousands of dollars. The investigation connected the detectives to multiple murders, attempted murders, and several other criminal activities. And among the cases mentioned in the investigation was the killing of Bobby Borello. According to federal prosecutors, the detectives had helped confirm Bobby's address before the attack. One of them even visited the house personally. Years earlier, Susan Borello had described an incident that suddenly became very important. Not long before Bobby was killed, a large detective had knocked on their door. He showed his badge and asked if Bobby lived there. Susan told him her husband was not home. The detective said he would return later, but he never did. After seeing photographs of the arrested detectives in the newspaper in 2005, Susan immediately recognized one of them. It was the same man who had stood at her door years earlier. Even more shocking, another detective connected to the case had been present during the investigation on the night of Bobby's death. The people who appeared to be investigating the crime had actually helped arrange it. It was a betrayal that stunned both the public and law enforcement. In 2006, Louis Eppolito and Stephen Caracappa were convicted in federal court. The charges included murder conspiracy, organized crime activity, and multiple other serious offenses connected to their secret partnership with the Lucchese crime family. A federal judge sentenced both men to life in prison plus additional decades. The case became one of the most shocking corruption scandals in the history of American law enforcement. For Bobby Borello, the trial finally answered the question she had lived with for 14 years. She now knew how the killers had found her husband. The other figures connected to the story also faced their own endings. Anthony Gaspipe Casso, the powerful Lucchese leader who had ordered many violent acts, eventually became a government informant in the 1990s. He admitted involvement in dozens of serious crimes. He received a massive prison sentence and died in custody in 2020. Frank Lastarino, the man who carried out the attack on Bobby Borello, later admitted involvement in multiple crimes as well. Meanwhile, the world Bobby had once lived in continued to change. John Gotti was convicted in 1992 on several serious federal charges. He was sentenced to life in prison and never returned to freedom. He died in federal custody in 2002. Today, the story of Bobby Borello remains one of the most unusual cases connected to organized crime in New York. Not just because of the violence involved, but because of the shocking betrayal at the center of it. Two police detectives sworn to protect the city, secretly working with one of the most dangerous crime figures in the country. Their actions allowed a rival organization to track and eliminate a man who stood very close to power. For Bobby Borello's family, the truth came too late. But it finally revealed how a quiet evening in Brooklyn turned into a tragedy that echoed through New York's criminal history. And it showed how, in that world, the line between law and crime could sometimes disappear completely.